Hello and welcome back to the Reaper. So we've got loads of videos, well 3 or 4 videos in our educational general section about the comms and the etiquette of joining a landing circuit and landing and taking off and taxiing to a runway. We've got several hours of videos there and they're really good, they're realistic. We had some guys help us make them who really know what they're doing and everything, and great. But some of you guys have said that you want a simplified kind of air quotes game version of that, and to be honest, that's what the Reapers use anyway, because it is a game at the end of the day. We want a simplified version that's where we don't have to remember so much of the etiquette and the comms. So what I'm going to do today is show you our simplified version, basically. Now, bearing in mind some of this is specific to the Grim Reapers, because we have an exceptional kind of circumstance. We have lots and lots of fast jets, up to 25 of us sometimes, and we have to get them down on a runway very quickly because we're always time limited. So just bear in mind that we had to change things around because of that, but it's still a good system that you can use on a public server and whatnot. It's simplified, but it works. Sorry for the arcadey drawing, but not much of an artist, as you know, but it should do for now. So the first thing, if we're dealing with taking off or landing, or landing, is we need to look at our considerations. We have to know the airbase radio, or the ATC radio frequency. So I'm going to assume that the reason you want this information is so you can go on a public server and interact with an ATC. So you'll find out the frequency, so you can tune it into your radio and actually do the talking with SRS radio, for instance. Then the second thing is you have to work out if this, or find out if this airbase is controlled or uncontrolled. So if it's controlled, then you'll have a human ATC in the tower who's directing things and issuing permissions. Or if it's uncontrolled, which is much more likely, because in DCS on public servers, it's very unlikely that you're actually going to have a human-controlled tower. And if it's uncontrolled, then there is no one in control of the ATC, and instead of talking to the ATC, you're actually going to be talking to the traffic, the other aircraft in the circuit. Next, you have to know which runway you're using. I think in DCS there are up to 4 runways per airfield, depending on the airfield. And we have to know which one is in use for landing. So in this example, we've got runway 09 here. The 09 just means the direction, the azimuth that the runway is facing. So this one is facing due east, so it is 09, so 090. If it was left, it would be 27, it would be going that way. If it was north, it would be 0 or 36, it would be heading up, and 18 down, and anything in between. So to keep just the pictures and everything simple, we're assuming it's at east facing runway, and that's what we've based this circuit drawing on. But bear in mind, you've always got to find out the runway. If it was 45, for instance, heading that direction, we would have to rotate all this associated circuit diagram kind of left by 45 degrees. So whenever you're approaching a runway for a landing and to get in a circuit, and whenever you do a landing, you have to get in a circuit first, assuming VFR conditions, and you found out which runway, then you have to apply this model to that correct orientation. And that's actually a really difficult thing to do, especially when you're new to this. I'm just about getting the hang of it now after 3 years, but it's something you have to think about. Next, you have to find out the the runway. Which circuit hand is it? Is it a left-hand circuit or a right-hand circuit? You'll only ever have left and right. The drawing we've done here is for a left-hand circuit. The Grim Reapers only do left-hand circuits, so we purely do that just to keep things simple, so we never have to ask the question. But outside of the Reapers, you may very well have a right-hand circuit. So if you imagine this is a left-hand circuit, and we know that because we take off and we turn left into the circuit. If it was a right-hand circuit, it would be exactly symmetrical. So you would take off and go right into the circuit, and around like that, onto a final like that. So this circuit diagram, we'll look at it a bit later. This is just used for landing. So before we go into that, let's do the taxi and takeoff, because it's just super simple. So you found out that it's runway 09 that we're operating from, so that's what we're going to be taking off and landing from. There may be a case in some airfields where the landing runway and the takeoff runway are different for various reasons, so just bear that in mind. But usually 90% of the time, the landing runway and the takeoff runway are going to be the same runway. So in our simplified version, if we are static on the ramp and ready to taxi, then we're going to say, the first thing we're going to say is our call sign, whatever that is, cap 12 or something. Call sign, taxiing to runway 09, assuming that it is an uncontrolled airfield. So in that case, you would be just telling the other traffic in the circuit that you are taxiing, and well, just everyone on that radio frequency. If it was a human controlled airfield, then it would be call sign request taxi to runway 09. And he will then say either give you permission and tell you to taxi to runway 09 or give you an order, or he'll say no, you do not have permission, in which case you'll have to wait and try again in a couple of minutes. If he gives you permission, if he says call sign taxi to runway 09, then that's fine, you go ahead and do that. And if the ATC ever gives you an order like that for takeoff or for landing, then you repeat back what they've said, just so that he knows that you've heard what he said. And if you say it back wrong, then he will correct you, and you'll keep going like that until you've understood and you're saying it back correctly. So if he said call sign taxi to runway 09, then you come back and say call sign taxi to runway 09. If you haven't heard what he said, because it is hard to hear people sometimes for bad radio or heavy accents or whatever, then you just say again. And he'll say it again until, again, we get to the final solution. So like I said, most of the time it's going to be an uncontrolled airfield, but just bear in mind that etiquette if it is a controlled airfield. The next thing we're going to say is once we've driven our aircraft to the runway, before we enter the runway, we'll hold and wait. It's very important to wait before you get onto the runway, because there may be guys that you can't see that are coming in to land. And we're going to ask for, well, if it's an uncontrolled airfield, then we're going to say call sign entering runway 09. Obviously, you know, like coming out of a road junction in a car, look left, look right, make sure no one's entering the runway or landing. Or if we've got a controlled airfield, then call sign request enter runway 09. And we go through the same thing. He's either going to say no, wait, or he's going to say enter runway 09, in which case you will repeat back enter runway 09. Then once we're on the runway and we're ready to take off, then call sign taking off runway 09. I haven't shown it, but again, if we've got a controlled airfield, then you're just going to do that, but the request takeoff runway 09. And that's it. In real life, there is other etiquette, comms etiquette you'll do it once you're in the air, but in a simplified game version like this, that's all we do. So next we're coming on to landing. In this particular case, we're going to be landing on runway 09, and it's going to be assumed that it is a left-hand circuit because of the reasons that I went through earlier. So I think we'll look at the circuit diagram first, and then we'll go through the comms. So we can be approaching, first of all, we can be approaching this runway from any angle. We could be coming from the east, from the north, from the northwest, from the southwest, the south, whatever. But whichever angle we approach it from, we want to come via this point here, and this is called our initial point. Now, I know this is going to upset people. Remember, this is a simplified version. There are different ways in reality of entering this circuit, but to keep things simple and uniform and easy, this is how we're going to do it for this game version, okay? This point here is called our initial point. That's a real life circuit point. It is 2 miles from the threshold of the runway. Sorry, I just realized I've drawn that wrong. The 2 miles is meant to be from here to the beginning of the runway there. That there is supposed to be 2 miles. I've just drawn it wrong because I'm silly. And it's what we call on the dead side of the runway. So if we go over here and we see this is the runway here, then anything on this side, so as you're approaching it, if you like, from the right hand side is the dead side of the runway. This is just only used for approaching the runway and or if you have to do a go around. And the other side is called the live side of the runway. That's the side where we do our actual circuit. And I probably should have explained before this, as this is a simplified version. I mean, what is this circuit all about? Why don't you go in and just land? Well, the circuit is there to enable multiple aircraft to land on the runway in an organized fashion. Without the circuit, nothing really works. Without the circuit, you'd have chaos. It's a way of controlling traffic around an aircraft, because you can't just go and land whenever you want at a runway, because if you do, then you're going to end up smacking into someone or causing chaos. So this is how runways work in real life, to have this circuit to organize. And the way it works, just very roughly, is the way I'm drawing this cursor. Planes just fly around this organized circuit like this, at a certain height, a certain speed, blah, blah, blah. And when the opportunity arises and they are in the correct position, then they can go and land. That way, for instance, we were taking off a massive squadron of F-15s from this runway that was going to take 10 minutes to get them all airborne. Then the guys who are in the landing circuit can just go around for 10 minutes in this organized fashion. And it's important that on the different stages of this circuit, that the aircraft in the landing circuit communicate with either the human tower or the traffic if it's an uncontrolled base, so that everyone knows where everyone is at one time. So that's the reason for the communication and the reason for the circuit. So the first point is this. It's the initial point we've talked about on the dead side. It'll always be on the dead side. So for a left-hand circuit, it's going to be on the right side as you're facing the runway. We are going to travel at this point at from the initial point in which we're 2,000 feet AGL and over 300 knots. So you're thinking, God, that's fast. You know, my Cessna's got to do that. Well, again, this is Reaper specific because we fly things like Tomcats and we need to get them down very quickly, more quickly than they would on a real life airfield. So that's why it's specific to us. In a more realistic scenario, you'll be doing much less than this, more like 150 knots or up to 200 knots, even in a fast jet. So we travel along the dead side of the runway. At some point, we break into the circuit. That's what this curve is here. Where we break into the circuit really is up to us. It can be anywhere between the threshold at the beginning of the runway and up to about 3 miles past that threshold. The runway might be, 2.5 miles long. And so you're either breaking over the runway or once you've passed the runway. It doesn't really matter, to be honest, where you break. And then we are heading down to what we call our circuit altitude. From then on, we maintain circuit altitude of 1,000 feet AGL for the Reapers and 300 knots IAS for the Reapers. Anything other than a warbird, which might not be able to do 300 knots IAS, that is what we're doing. If it's a warbird for us, we just go basically as fast as we can. Again, for the reason of just getting people down as quickly as possible. This is also known as the crosswind leg. Then we're going to do another 90 degrees left and we're going to go into our downwind leg. Our downwind, again, 1,000 feet circuit, 300 knots. And this is just, if you like, backtracking back down the runway. Once we have passed the beginning of the runway, the threshold of the runway by a certain amount, and this I say is optional depending on conditions. And there are several conditions which determine this here. For instance, there may be some guy in front of you on a final approach, and therefore the human ATC may need to ask you to extend a little further on this downwind leg. Also, depending on the jet you're flying. So certain jets will want to turn in and literally land with no downwind extension. And some jets you'll want to go several miles downwind to get a nice long final approach. So that's why I've said that's optional. So once you've passed the threshold of the runway by the optional amount, we're going to do a left turn into our base leg and then another left turn onto our final approach. This is where we break the circuit speed. So this turn here is where we break the circuit speed and altitude regulation because we're essentially going on to our final approach. So you can see here it's a kind of a curve, then a straight, then a curve. Quite often what you'll see is just one long 180 degree curve. And we get down to the approach method of the aircraft, which is going to differ for each aircraft, how you actually go and land on that runway. And obviously the speed will be suited at this point to that aircraft, whether it's 50 knots for a Spitfire or 150 knots for a F-15. Some other sizes we can look at. So this distance here is not too important. I don't know if it's important in real life. I'm not a real pilot, so I don't know. But in DCS, for our simple version, what we say is between 0.25 and 1 mile is about the distance that we have there when we're running parallel to the runway. For the when we're traveling on the dead side of the runway, for our entry into the circuit, or if we're doing a go around, it's much smaller, usually about 0.1 to 0.25 miles. Our upwind leg, we've already talked about that, and I think that's everything else there covered. So next we need to drive the imaginary circuit and go through the comms that we need to do, and these are the essential stripped down basic comms for our game version of this. So the first thing we want to do is make our first call when we're approaching the airfield, and this could be the distance could be 20 miles, 30 miles, 50 miles. It doesn't really matter. What we're doing is an initial call to let the airfield know that we're on our way, how far we are out, and from which direction we are coming. So let's say 20 miles. It doesn't really matter in our simplified version. At 20 miles, airbase tower. So let's just say it's Sochi. So if it's a controlled airfield with a tower, we say tower. If it's an uncontrolled, we say traffic. So in this case, Sochi tower, or no, traffic, we'll say it's an uncontrolled. Cap 1 to approaching from the northwest, 20 miles out for landing on runway 09. So let's split that down. We're saying who we're talking to first, then we say who we are, then we say that we're approaching from the direction. I've missed it out, but we usually say the distance as well, so they know roughly how far away we are. and then what our intention is. And in this case, in our simplified version, it's always going to be for landing runway 09. In reality, you could approach for different reasons. There are 4 other calls we're going to be doing, and what should we say is that at this point in our simpler version, some of these are informational calls, some of them are requests. In fact, these 4 here, A to D, are informational calls. We're not asking a question, we're just telling you, or telling the subject, what we're doing. Only E here is the actual question, requesting permission, and we'll go through that in a bit. So we've approached, and whichever way approach from, the idea of drawing these purple lines is that we can come from any direction. It shows how if we're coming from the east here, that's how we're going to come into the circuit. If we are coming from the south, that's how we're going to come into the circuit. If we're coming from the northwest, that's how we're coming. So we're always coming via B. Once we reach B, which is 2 miles out, as best you can guess, basically, on the dead side, bearing in mind all of these dimensions that we've got here, we're going to call B, and it's just going to be call sign initial cap 1, 2, whatever my name is, initial. And that's letting either the tower and or the traffic know where we are. That way they can build up a reference, a situational awareness of where our aircraft is on the circuit. And that's how all this works. You're just building up situational awareness of the tower or the traffic, depending on controlled or uncontrolled. Next, we travel our upwind into entry, again 2,000 feet, and we're probably going to be above 300 knots at this point, all the way past the threshold of the runway until we decide between 0 and 3 miles that we're going to break into the circuit. The break into the circuit is going to be a left-hand 90 degree roughly, and we're going to be descending to the circuit altitude and speed limit, which is what we've got here. As we do this break, we say call sign breaking into circuit. So again, we're not requesting, we're just doing it and letting everyone know that we're doing it. Cap 1, 2, breaking into circuit. Now everyone on that circuit knows that that's where we are at the moment. That's how they build up their picture if they can't see us. And the chances are they won't be able to see us because we're talking about several miles of distance, okay? We're going to go through our crosswind leg. We're going to do our left turn once we've covered the distance that we've agreed earlier. We're staying on our 1,300 knots. During the downwind leg, and it doesn't really matter where on the downwind, you can do it mid downwind, you can do it early downwind, you can do it late downwind, and you'd usually specify. So let's just say for whatever reason, we're declaring late downwind at this point. So on the downwind, we're going to call sign cap 11 late downwind. Then everyone in the circuit or the tower knows that roughly that's where we are in the circuit at the moment, and then they can plan accordingly. Next, we're going to turn into our final. We're going to turn through our base leg into our final. Once we have, again, this could be a big merge, the whole thing could be a big merge turn, so it's a bit ambiguous, this bit here. But generally, when you are on what we would class as this final approach here, we're going to do our final call. And this is going to be the request, assuming it's a controlled airbase. So if it's a uncontrolled airbase and you're talking to the traffic, then it's just going to be call sign cap 11 final, just letting people know that you're on the final, you've got a mile or 2 miles to go, basically, so they know that you're about to land. Or if it's a controlled airbase at this point, with cap 11 request final. And at that point, if it was a controlled airfield, they would either say continue final or something along those lines. You know, we're not going to get too accurate because it is just a game version. Or they're going to say go around. And they might say go around because there's someone in front of you and you're too close to them, or someone's just entered the runway, or someone's on the runway waiting to take off, or whatever. Someone's just crashed on the runway, you know, it's DCS at the end of the day. And then they're going to say go around, and you just say repeat as we said earlier with our etiquette, which is cap 11 go around, or cap 12 go around. In that case, all we would do is go around, and we're going to feed back into this upwind leg here and start the circuit again. We would be, except because we're already in the circuit, coming from within the circuit, we'll stay at 1000 AGL and 300 IAS. And when we break into the circuit, kind of back into the circuit here, we will not call the break at that point because we're already legally in the circuit at that time. You only call the break into the circuit when you've come into the circuit for the first time. In reality, I think most circuits you call the crosswind leg, but in our game version, we don't do that. Again, remember, we've got 20 people in a very short space going around. We try to simplify it as much as possible so the radio comms just aren't, you know, they're more manageable. So that's why we don't do that. Keep everything as simple as we can. Basically, the basic information that we need to know. And that's it. If it's an uncontrolled airfield, you call your final, and you'll only go around if you see something on the runway, like you see a F-15 taking off or whatever, then you'll just declare yourself, go around, and then you'll go around. It's as simple as that. It's really simple stuff, especially the simplified version. And like I said, if you're not going for full milsim, I recommend it. It's what we use, and it works really well. We literally haven't had, apart from people just being really stupid and, you know, getting their landing wrong, we haven't had a single problem with this model for at least the last year. Things to note are that this is only for VFR conditions, so good visual conditions where you can see the runway, you can get in a proper downwind leg. What we usually say, if it's IFR, if it's instrument landing, if it's clouds and fog and you can't see the runway, then we usually don't do a circuit. In that case, what we would do is get to initial, and at that point initial would actually be 10 miles away, and then just come straight in. And so we'd miss all of this downwind leg. We wouldn't break into a circuit. It's just down straight in, because of an IFR landing you need a big long approach of about 10 miles to use whatever instrument you're going to be using, you know, your ILS, your TACAN, whatever it is in whatever plane you're going to be using. So that's one thing to bear in mind. I guess you could do circuits in IFR, but it's not something we do. We just go straight in. And again, as long as you keep good comms, it's very rare that you're actually going to have a problem for that. Maybe I'll do a separate video about IFR later, but this is what you guys wanted, and so this is what I've given today. That's all I've got to say on that. I hope it helps, and see you later.